I'm Loretta Ross, and I'm the Treaty Commissioner at the Treaty Relations Commission of Manitoba. We're thrilled to be producing this four-part series for the second time here at our Agouti Center. Our goal with this series is to bring together treaty-focused leaders from all sectors to acquire best practice knowledge on a meaningful way to honor, recognize, and implement First Nation treaties and the treaty relationship as a benefit to all Canadians. This series will build on our discussions from our 2021 series and will continue to explore the importance and significance of the treaties and the treaty relationship. We will learn about the original spirit and intent of the treaties, where we are today, and how we can move forward together. It is our hope that everyone that is watching these video series will take away the best practice knowledge on how to take informed action, get involved, and make change to honor, recognize, and implement the treaties and the treaty relationship. Without further ado, joining me today is Kerry Harvey from the Mennonite Central Committee, who works as the coordinator for the Indigenous Settler Relations Program. I'm going to talk just a little bit about Kerry's bio, and then we're going to exchange in some conversation about his view with respect to treaties and the treaty relationship. So Kerry's work in the Indigenous Neighbours Program aims to facilitate relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples towards reconciliation and strategies for justice. He has been in his current position since 2016, and in the past, Kerry has worked with the First Nations youth in Cranberry Portage, Manitoba, did restorative justice, community building, and advocacy for the MCC Newfoundland and Labrador, and served as peace advisor for MCC Bangladesh. Now that we know a little bit more about Kerry and his work towards reconciliation and justice, let's dive into some questions. So Kerry, do you recall when you first learned about the treaties, and perhaps what was your take and understanding of what treaties were all about?
Yeah, I remember hearing about them in school when I was a kid. I'll say first that I didn't actually grow up here in Manitoba. I grew up south of the border in this U.S. border in South Dakota, in Dakota Territory, which is where my Mennonite ancestors settled. And that was right around the same time, like 1870s, mid 1870s, the same time when, Treaty 1 was signed here and when a lot of the first migrations of Mennonites came here as well. So that's where I grew up, and that's where my ancestors, received free land from the Homestead Act, largely free. Anyway, so I remember growing up there and, hearing about treaties and hearing about it in school. But I remember it was spoken of as if it was sort of a thing of the past, right? It was sort of spoken of as if it was something that was, not really relevant for me today. It was sort of, like, okay, that's our history. That's something that happened back then. And then they would talk about, I remember it was spoken about that, that treaties were often came with broken promises with displaced peoples, that there was that hurt and that wrong. And I felt sad about that and it felt wrong, but I didn't really, there was also this sort of sense in which it was almost inevitable, right? Like that was how it was presented. Like this was just how it was going to be. And there's not much that we could really do about it. And, that's what was the way it was meant to be. And I think I sort of, carried that notion with me, even when I came to Canada, and then arrived in Manitoba as well. And even though I sort of, and even as I was doing this work, I, began to learn a lot more, but I hadn't really questioned that idea. And it wasn't until maybe 7 years ago, that Adrian Jacobs, who's a Haudenosaunee elder, he came and spoke at our Knowledge Keeper. He came and spoke at our organization. And he was talking about this idea of treaty and talking about treaties. And he spoke about this idea that treaties weren't just about about dividing of the land, that which was sort of my conception of it, that rather that, and this is from the First Nations point of view, and I think also from the Anishinaabe point of view here, that, the reserve land was meant to be set aside for First Nations exclusive use. This was before the Indian Act. And then the rest of this land was meant to be shared, right? It was meant to be a shared space. And there's something about that really sort of switched a light bulb for me that I hadn't really thought about that before. And I hadn't really thought, okay, what does that mean to be shared space? My idea, I think, was still in that notion that treaty was meant to be about dividing the land, right? About, this is ours, this is yours. And, and that's the way it was meant to be. Even if it was, not always just, that was the way I thought of it. But this notion of being in a shared space was kind of, I thought it was, significant for me. Because we were then, we had a shared responsibility to be in the space together. And, this dividing was a very European white way of thinking, right? So I think since then, my lens has been quite different. When I think about, it changes the way I think about things like land acknowledgements, for example. If we're in a shared space, why do we, it's about how do I share that protocol about land, this is a shared space in which we're being together. And I also think it's changed my way of thinking about Indigenous education, Indigenous settler education, specifically as I'm talking with other settlers. How do we understand our story? It's a very different way than we've told our story here in Canada in the past.
So you've touched on a number of things that I think I'd like to follow up on. One is the fact that you've come here from the United States, and of course they have their own experience with the First Peoples there, which in some ways is similar because it's coming with that certain perspective of conquering and right, taking the land. How they did it was different, certainly than here in Canada and certainly here where we are in Manitoba. But I think the premise, as you've talked about, is the same from the non-First Nation approach. And from the First Nation side, that concept of sharing. So there's some commonalities in how they approach the relationship, and but difference in how they did that, right, from the States and to Canada. So that's an interesting perspective, I think, that people need to be aware of as well, like the differences that, there's treaties all across these lands, right? Turtle Island or North America as people, but how they were entered into can vary, and the people that entered into them from the First Nation side are also different. And so one of the other things, I guess, which comes from that is those differences, and the Haudenosaunee elder in sharing that with you is something I don't think people really understand, that they're all the same, kind of that same thing. They're all the same, and yet, as you said, he struck a chord with you in saying, no, there are differences, right? And differences in what the treaties meant for the First Peoples, and that's a concept that hasn't been explored until very, very recently, I think. First Nations people have always talked about that, but nobody's really paid attention or listened because the narrative has always been kind of this is mine and this is yours has always, I think, been the dominant aspect to it. But so very interesting. Thanks for sharing. And again, different aspects to understanding treaties and the treaty relationship. Sure. And so now if we move to some of the current things that you're involved in, the We Are All Treaty People celebration that's been happening for the last, 6 years?
Yeah, 6-7 years.
Or so?
Yeah, yep.
And that's almost in time linking with your experience with the Haudenosaunee elder.
Yeah, it is,
right?
Actually. It's very true. Right?
Yeah.
It started around that same time. In fact, it was right around that time where there was a gathering, and this is sort of the beginnings of how it started. There was a gathering of a number of different church groups and other non-Indigenous folks, and the including like the there was a Quaker, Quakers were there, Mennonites, Anglicans, a number of other folks like that. And there was a Cree Anglican priest there who's still a part of our working group today, who gave this challenge to the those who were there, particularly the non-Indigenous folks like myself. And he said, on First Nations, in First Nations communities, we celebrate treaty every year, right? There's treaty days and we talk about treaty and we talk about how important it is. But by and large, we don't see the settler folks talking about that at all, right? It's just not part of the conversation. Kind of going back to this idea that's a thing of the past, right? And so his challenge was, what can you do? What can you do as non-Indigenous folks to say, yeah, treaty's important. If you say that this is important, what can we do together? But, what can you take the initiative on? And so that's actually sort of how this We Are All Treaty People celebration started, was it was actually the Quakers that sort of took up this mantle and said, this challenge, and said, yeah, we could do something. And some of the Mennonites came along and said, well, we can help with bring some food. And then a number of folks, and it started small. And it started with this sort of small effort to say, let's come together and let's celebrate, and let's, bring artists, bring musicians together, bring some dancers, and celebrate each other's culture. But what was important about that was that it was, settler-led, that it was, or at least settler initiated, but done in collaboration. So, it was about saying, as settlers, it's important for us to be doing something. And so we're gonna take the initiative here, but we're gonna be doing it in consultation. And of course, since then, we've been incredibly grateful for working together with the Treaty Relations Commission in Manitoba, in putting this event on. And when I think about the other part of it, like this word celebrate, to celebrate, it's like, it suggests to me that, to celebrate something is that it means it's important to you, right? It doesn't mean that we're glossing over the wrongs of the past, the fact that treaties haven't been kept well, or, that they've often been unjust. But it does mean that we're going to say that they're important, important to us as well, and that we acknowledge that we're in this relationship. So it's not, it's about celebrating the beauty of the other, but it's also, it's about going beyond that to changing the relationship and saying this relationship is important and we need to shift the way we are in relationship together.
Mm-hmm. So, as part of the settler community, and I know that it's settler led, to kind of bring that importance and raise that awareness.
Sure.
How do you think its impact has been from, when you started, like, it's been about, like you said, about 6 years. So what is the difference from maybe the first year to this past year?
Yeah. Well, certainly we've had more people come out, and I think we've, gotten better at organizing, which does help too. But I think, it's kind of neat to be able to have it at the Forks here, because it, there's people that end up walking by and saying, oh, what's happening? And maybe they'll stop and learn and listen for a little bit and learn something about treaty. We've been really grateful to have some of the elders, including from the Treaty Relations Commission, often come and share about what does treaty mean and how do we think about that differently as treaty people. So I think it's pushed people to say, this is, when I think about being a treaty person, this applies to me as well. And I think it's also been really neat just to see the relationships that have formed over the years and developing this. A couple of years ago in 2021, when we had the 150th anniversary of Treaties 1 and 2, we had a commemoration, and that one took place in the Kapabamekachak Healing Forest. But it brought together faith leaders and community leaders, as well as Indigenous elders, and there was ceremony, and I think it was such a significant time to say, this is something that we need to continuously renew this relationship. And so I think it's over the last few years, it's really grown and expanded. In this last year, it was neat to see the people that came out and how many more people came.
Well, when we talk about treaties and we talk about that treaties and the treaty relationship, I think what we've found or what we see over the years from, if we think back to the 1870s and prior to this us and them mentality has lingered and continues to, affect that treaty relationship. And so opportunities like that, bringing people together, I think helps to break down those barriers and not to be so afraid of your neighbor, and the First Nations people. It starts to build again some of that trust, which were important elements, getting to know each other, all important elements that were the foundation of the treaty relationship, right? It's you have to live here together. So let's learn and have food together, have some coffee or whatever it is, but be able to do it in a comfortable setting. Sometimes we tend to think of treaties as well as that formal part of it, but it's just living together every day, right? So we've kind of covered what I was going to ask you in terms of, the We Are All Treaty People celebration. What does that phrase then mean for you, We Are All Treaty People?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, and I think about that. I think about that as a settler person, right? Which is, something we don't often think about as a settler person. What does it mean to be a treaty person? And I mean, I know that term is something that has been, some people are wary of saying I'm a settler person, right? What does that mean? And for me, I've chosen to embrace that term of being a settler, partly because, well, for a few reasons. One is that it identifies me as a non-Indigenous person, but also as a person that whose ancestors did settle here, right? It settled in Turtle Island in North America, and that the land that was given, the security and the wealth, even if I'm not rich today, that sort of has trickled down to me. Like there's still that security and wealth that's I benefit from, and I acknowledge that as part of the reality of who I am. But it also, reminds me that I'm part of this bigger project of settler colonialism, which, settler colonialism was, based on the doctrine of discovery, this sense of entitlement that, finders keepers notion, right? And domination and all of that, we could come and take the land, and there's this erasure of Indigenous identity. And so when I think about We Are All Treaty People and what does it mean for me to be a treaty person, it sort of flips that on this head for me, that rather than thinking about my right to be here and my sense of justification for being in this land coming from this entitlement, these doctrines that are very racist and part of that past, it rather suggests that my right to be here, my justification for being here comes from treaty, in some sense. That, going back to this idea of, the land being a shared space, I remember a Maycraft, who's, Anishinaabe lawyer, a legal scholar, and she said these words once, that treaties are the source of legitimate settler presence in our territories, or treaties are the source of legitimate settler presence in Indigenous lands. And that really struck me. That really I found that really interesting, because that means that I'm a guest, right? That means that I'm a guest in this territory, rather than the sense of being entitled to be in this space. My right to be here comes from the graciousness of the hosts, the First Nations that were here before me. Even if that, wasn't always, even if settlers weren't always welcomed here, there was, or wanted to be here, there was nevertheless this sort of graciousness offered by treaty. And so what that does is it shifts my way of thinking about why I'm here and how I'm here. I mean, when I think about how my parents, modeled what does it mean to be a good guest, right? Like when you go to someone's place, you want to be cautious and, and aware of your surroundings, so you don't break things in someone's house, right? But also, respectful of the way they do things and the protocols of how things are done in that space. And also come with a sense of humility, like, that I was wanting to learn, like that there's so much that I don't know. And so this bringing this sense of humility is also really important to me. Yeah. Yeah. And I think when I think about how much we have to learn, like, I think for too long, we, non-Indigenous folks have taken, this approach that we're the ones that have control of the land and the control of the space. But I really think we should be the ones that should be learning from Indigenous folks, from yourselves, about how to be in this space, right? And how to be live in this space better, right? I mean, so being a treaty person to me is about sort of changing that narrative of sort of expanding my story and seeing that the narrative that I was told as a child isn't the whole story, right? That even if I didn't create this mess, I still have a responsibility and an opportunity, really, to be part of making things right. And so it's not about feeling guilty per se, but it is about saying I want to be a good guest and I want to take responsibility for making sure that this land that's been shared with us is respected.
And I think that's great as well, because that talks about a mind shift. You talked about the way we look at different things that we've learned about and sharing the land and that type of thing. It's a mind shift that we have to go to get into and not be afraid to look at things from a different perspective and in the way that you described it. And so it kind of segues into another question in terms of, what do you think is the most misunderstood thing that people may have with respect to the treaties and treaty relationship?
It's an interesting question. Well, one of them, I think, is this notion that treaties are a thing of the past, that rather they're really this ongoing relationship, right? This notion that it's something that is relevant for me today. And that needs to be continuously renewed, which is why we're working on efforts like this Treaty People Celebration. The other thing, though, too, is I think that often we as settlers rarely look deeper. Maybe all of us rarely look deeper at the worldview differences between different peoples. I mean, we tend to see the water that we swim in, and that's about it. And one of those areas that I think is sort of a significant difference is in this area of kinship or relationship. And I remember hearing Aaron Mills, who is, I know you've had him come speak as well before, and he's talking about this idea of treaty being not so much about contract, but about kinship. And it sort of implies this relationship. But it's pretty different from the way I've approached, that we approach relationship, I think, from a Western point of view, from a non-Indigenous point of view. We largely, we have relationship with family, and we, have care about, but it's largely on an individual level, right? It's largely about, my rights in relation to yours, how to protect my own, that kind of thing. But rather, my understanding is how he was talking about it is that there's kinship from this other perspective is rather about responsibilities, and is not things that you're forced to do per se, but things that you maybe want to do or you feel compelled to do because you're in that authentic relationship, and that you're you want the well-being of the other. And so, and I think for those of us, we can certainly understand that on a personal level, but on a bigger level, like on the community level or in relationship with the land, I think that's something that I know I certainly haven't really figured out how to understand that, right? It's something I have a lot to learn, right? And I realize that that's an area where, it's a very different way of thinking than I understand things, even though, that sort of kinship idea, I think, is one of those bases that form Indigenous legal thinking, right? Ways of thinking. And so, so when it comes to these sort of worldview differences, I realize how much that I I don't know and how much I have to learn, right? And I think until recently, I didn't realize that this is something that I really need to grapple with and internalize in order to come to really understand what treaties mean for me, right? And just the other thing to say about kinship is also it's about the land, right? Kinship with the land, and so that's where treaties have a bigger context as well. They're not just about, they're also about consent on, First Nations consent in their own space and looking at questions around, resource extraction and hydro and pipelines and those kinds of things. And, that gets into complicated questions about treaty and courts, but it's certainly very much, I think, an important part of our nation-to-nation relationship. And again, an area where I'm just beginning to learn, but realizing that treaties have a really complex, entail a really complex part of our larger Canadian relationship and Canadian Indigenous relationship, and how do we respect that and respect the shared territories in which we are.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting. You talk about another aspect where, those different worldviews and that family aspect, that kinship aspect, that
Right.
we're all related and we're all connected, not just as two-leggeds or as human beings, but with everything that surrounds us, right? Nature, and we're talking now about global impacts and nature and how that's impacting us and what we've done
Right.
as humans to get there. And all of that is completely involved in that First Nation worldview.
Right.
And I think when we start to understand or talk about treaties and the treaty relationship, we don't just come from one perspective. We have to certainly give the other perspective, the First Nation perspective, that equal
Yep.
space, right? And it's not starting from here and going to there. It's actually finding a space in the middle and understanding those different perspectives. And there's a lot to learn. And so I congratulate you for your humility in saying, you don't know. You do know, a lot, I think, by general standards, not First Nation standards. But, certainly I'm still learning. And there's always so much to learn, and I think that's the humility aspect to this relationship, is we're continuously learning about each other. That annual renewal that's done in the treaty days that you talked about, that First Nations people hold every year, and now that the We Are All Treaty People celebration, I think, aims to get to, is there's something we're going to learn every year. Like, how was your year? What can we do to make this next year better for you? Or maybe what have we done that caused harm or had some negative impact on you that we have to correct, that we have to change, and we have to work together how we make those changes.
Right.
Like, it sounds very simple, and it can be very simple, but we tend to overcomplicate things. And I think that's the beauty of the We Are All Treaty People celebration, is having those conversations and getting, again, back to those foundations of treaty and reciprocity and, understanding each other and having those conversations. So,
And it's one thing to know something with your head, right? And it's another thing to sort of know it with your heart and to know it with your full sense and to actually really experience that relationship. I think that's one of those areas where I've observed others, particularly, Indigenous folks that I've been in relationship with, seeing them have that relationship in a way that I haven't really, known what that means. And so it's a growing experience. It's a journey, right? It's a lifelong journey. I think.
yeah, absolutely. And I know certainly the elders say we can give you something to read, and that's the thing that I often get. What can I read, to learn about treaties? And there's that aspect. There's that intellectual, aspect to it, and learning, and in university or other places to learn through books and Google or whatever it is.
Right.
But that experience, I think, pushes you so much further along in understanding that relationship. Sitting down and, as you say, just watching.
Yeah.
Right? Watching how people engage, watching how people talk, or listening to how people talk and what they're talking about, brings you so much more in appreciating that relationship and having a better understanding of it. And so I encourage people that are in the Winnipeg area, to come and to have experience that we are all treaty people. And as you said, it's growing, and to even look to have their own in their areas, right? Because it does do, I think, a lot for the soul.
Yeah.
Right. It does a lot for that as well.
And we want it to be really open and welcoming, family friendly. So it's, anyone's welcome in all ages. And
On
it's
all
been cool.
ages. And I think the other aspect to that, and certainly something that we work very hard at the commission, is creating a safe space, a brave space for people to be brave and ask those questions. This is what my grandfather has always said, or this is what I learned here at school. Tell me more about this, and how does that connect to treaty? Because we often get caught up in the facts and dates and events, and that's it. Right. And there's so much more to understanding it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So for someone now that's worked in reconciliation and justice for many years, Kerry, how have you seen the treaty relationship? Have you seen the treaty relationship improve? And if so, how have you seen it improve?
It's an interesting question. I certainly have seen changes in the last couple decades since I've been in Canada and doing more engaged in this work. And I think, some of that has certainly been for the positive. I think the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the work around the UN Declaration, the inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women, all of those kinds of things have really contributed to public awareness. So that's significant. And I think not just public awareness, but I think the discourse has changed. I see my children, are in school, the education, they're coming back and they're talking about treaty medals, and they're, talking about how, they had a residential school survivor come and talk to their school, and, and what they learned from that. And I think that's really hopeful, because I think it really shows how much we've shifted in really maybe just one generation in our awareness. So that's really, really helpful and hopeful. I also don't want to overplay that. I also think that, we also, apologies are great, but they don't change anything, unless you make a concerted effort to change. You can't just say I'm sorry and move on, right? And so I think our colonial realities in this country still exist, and I think that's an important thing to acknowledge, that there's that sense of entitlement, that the justifications for using the doctrine of discovery, those mentalities still exist in our government and in our corporations and our ways of interacting by and large, right? So that's still present. And I remember hearing the story of an elder, or an elder tell this story. He was from Long Plain First Nation, and he talked about this treaty medal, right? And I think it's an interesting, image, because something that settlers often see, and where you have these two individuals, holding hands, the settler and the Indigenous person, and he talked about how right now the treaty medal is like a skew, right? That that all of the resources and the wealth and the control of the land, all of that is in the hands of settler people. And that if we're really going to work towards equity and towards reconciliation and honoring the treaties, we need to, balance that out, write that out, and change the power balance. And that to me is a powerful image, because it reminded me that, like, okay, yeah, we need to shift the way we do things. We need to shift our the trajectory we're on, which isn't going to be easy, because capitalism and consumption and all those things, and that way of thinking about the land as sort of like a resource to be extracted is very much a part of our way of thinking. So it's not going to shift overnight, but I think it's really important. So I guess if there's anything I can think of that we need to do to continue to improve our relationship, it's approaching this with humility, and approaching this with a sense of, I need to respect the land. I need to change my relationship with the land, and then our relationship with each other in terms of how the resources are shared. in this shared space, shared treaty space.
So as a settler, we know that across Canada we've had, and even in Manitoba, we've had other inquiries. You
Right.
talked about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry. I mean, those are not the only inquiries we've had. We've had the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. We've had the Manitoba Aboriginal Justice Inquiry. What do you think has shifted in the settler mindset or in the settler community from when those commissions and reports were done? Because a lot of the same issues that we're talking about in the recent inquiries were also talked about then. So what has shifted from, do you think, if there's anything that you could kind of pinpoint, or in the settler community, or as I said, in the settler mindset, that maybe has made things.
That's interesting. I mean, that's a good question. I mean, I do remember them talking about the Royal Commission, that it was largely put on a shelf. I mean, all that, thousands of pages of work was largely put on a shelf and not much was done with it. I do think perhaps education. I wonder if that's maybe one of the keys. I think that, from the university age down, we've started to talk about things differently. And certainly it's not across the board. And certainly there's a lot of myths still out there and a lot of misconceptions, which I see and I'm still struggling with. I still encounter in myself, right? But I think that might be one of the keys of what's beginning to shift things. And, like I see so many young people that are really, really are beginning to get this and are really convicted. And I'm talking about young non-Indigenous folks, settlers that are really wanting to say, I want to get involved and I want to do something different. I want to see a different future. And so that's my perception of what it might be. But.
Do you think, how much impact do you think things like the media have? Because if you think back in, the 90s when those reports were happening, I mean, our main source of communication and information was television, for example. We didn't have internet. We didn't have, all of these other social media influences. And we were totally almost reliant on what we learned in institutions, like in the school system.
Right.
So do you think that has also had an impact, do you think, on how people think their exposure to information and other forms of education?
Certainly, I would think so. I mean, certainly being able to hear stories, like being able to hear the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the stories of survivors, and I mean, a lot of people actually attended in person, but being able to hear them and other, through media, I think that has a big impact. At the same time, social media has, all the different voices, right? So people need to be, critical of what they hear too, and not just sort of like, because you can certainly hear naysayers and people, offering other perspectives. And so like I think that, there maybe the critical piece of the education part is making or helping people think critically, and sort of discern, okay, this is actually what I think is true. Or this is why. Okay, this is a new story. This is a narrative that I haven't heard before. I need to look at this in a careful way and really examine it. And so, I think medium plays a big part, certainly. But it's always a mixed bag to a certain degree.
So when we're talking about like moving forward and being an ally to First Nation people, or being a treaty partner, really is what it is. Being engaged in the treaty relationship and the treaty process. Just generally, what do you think are what can people do more, but also what are some of the challenges that perhaps you face that maybe I'm not aware of as at the Treaty Commission, that we can either help, or just kind of some things that you think when you go back to the settler community. What are still some of the challenges that we have to deal with?
One of the things I see a lot in the conversations I have with constituents and the churches and other places, is that I think there's still a lot of fear. Right. I think there's still a lot of fear, and fear of the other, fear of those who are different than us. And, and I mean, I've experienced that myself. So, I understand where that comes from, and, and it takes a certain amount of, willingness to get beyond that. But, like, I think there's also this fear of, fear of making mistakes, like people wanting to do things, but okay, knowing that we've done things wrong in the past, what if I do it wrong, right? And so like not wanting to take that step maybe. And then, a fear of that. I mean, certainly that's also present, a fear of scarcity, that, I might have to lose something in this process, right? That if I'm really to embrace treaty, that I have to lose something. And, and certainly I think that there is a sense in which we as settlers need to be setting aside some of our privilege or using that in ways to change the power balances. But I don't think that needs to be like this, scarcity thing, or this, it's a zero-sum game, right? That there is this sense of abundance. And, I'm a person that firmly believes that, the opposite of fear is love and compassion, right? That, if we can start living into that action of compassion, then we can get beyond our fears pretty quick, So I think if you're asking ways in which we can, work together and building, finding ways to be together and to sort of challenge some of those fears that we have of each other. I think that's an important way, and probably also learning from examples of others. There's a lot of I've in this work, in this work in the last years, I've seen a lot of examples of people doing things like, getting out and saying, I can do something small, finding one small call to action, from like, for example, the Kapabame Kachak Healing Forest, right? Those started from two non-Indigenous teachers saying, what can we do in this community? And they brought together a bunch of folks in the community, and this idea emerged and it came to fruition and it developed this space. And, it's just that a little bit of initiative to say, it's something I can do. So like, finding those examples and sharing those examples and saying, oh yeah, this isn't that hard to do, or the work around the UN declaration that, that I was amazed myself how much small grassroots efforts can bring that. And that, I mean, certainly we have a long way to go in really honoring the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, but at least bringing that to the national conversation in the federal, in the parliament. And I think that was pretty significant, So those kinds of examples we can learn from each other.
So, I mean, that kind of leads me to a bit of the last question. How can we encourage reconciliation actions, such as learning about the treaties? And if someone came up and said, Kerry, what can I do? What can I do? Where do I start?
Right. Yeah. I think one of those is, finding, like I said, a call to action that relates to you, or looking at, things like the Royal Commission. I mean, those are, sometimes hard to wade through, but also finding an area that is that one is passionate about. Like, for example, I work with a number of folks that are really passionate around impacts of hydro in the north. And that's one of those things that there's a lot of work to be done, and understanding and unpacking that, and supporting those who've experienced some really negative impacts in the north. So finding like-minded folks that, or, if you're in your church or your community setting where you can have conversations around, what could reparations look like? What could we, how do we understand the land that we're on, and unpack that history, but then also, look at maybe giving something back and as a community. It doesn't always have to be as individuals. I think that's an important part of it, is like, if I think about it as an individual, like, what can I do? It can feel really daunting, but finding others, because there are other people in the community doing things or that want to do it, and figure out how you can do it together I think that's pretty significant. Finding, ways that, I think that, and of course, working together, I think always making sure that we're following the lead of Indigenous peoples, of First Nations peoples, and coming alongside, rather than saying, okay, I got things figured out, this is how we're going to fix the problems, but rather this is, I want to come alongside, I want to bring my presence, but I want to bring it in a respectful and a listening way, and a way that we can collaborate together. I think it's also a really important posture to come. So yeah, how can we be together as treaty partners, I think is a really important. It's a really important opportunity for us.
Yeah. And I think just reflecting on our conversation, the relationships evolve as well. And, sometimes we also get hung up on terms, how we describe Indigenous, First Nation, settler,
Right.
like those terms are what we're using now. But I think we also have to be thinking of how do we evolve our language, because I know certainly if we talk about the word settler, First Nations people say, well, we were here long before, but as you've kind of couched it in that settler colonial aspect. So I think we have to be aware of those types of words that we use and provide, as you've done, some of that context for why I'm using that phrase, right? Or that word. And so again, it's giving each other that space, giving each other that understanding of, okay, how are you coming into this? And right. And I think that's really what the relationship was always intended to be as well. You're bringing this and what do I need to do to understand why? And then how do we move forward together?
Absolutely. Yeah. And, and it's okay to make mistakes and to not, to know, I'm saying things wrong all the time, right? Or to fumble through this together, but to try, right? And if you use the wrong term to find some, ways of educating, learning oneself, and and trying better next time, right? I see that happening, and I think that's an important step that we can do.
Absolutely, that humility. And it was like I used the word settler and I was corrected on it. And it was a perspective that I hadn't thought about.
Okay.
Right. And so it's not saying you're using that word and bringing that word. I think we hear that a lot. And so, at some point as we start to learn more about each other, find ways of describing each other in a different way as well. And that's all part of, I think, the process. And as you said, have to be prepared sometimes and have to be okay with somebody correcting you, right? Because I think if we hold each other, to this expectation that you can't make a mistake, then we're starting off in the wrong way. And I think we have to be accepting of that as well and know that we're going to make mistakes as we go and continue to develop and build a stronger relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's not easy to necessarily jump out of your comfort zone, right? To try something new, to, be in a space that isn't your own space or that isn't, but there's also something when you take that step, that's been my experience. It's like all of a sudden you realize, okay, this is uncomfortable for a little bit. But then there's also like, okay, some amazing things that I haven't experienced before and that I learn from them and I take with me and can really in some ways, change one's perspective on life.
Yeah.
So that's really valuable.
Yeah. So again, having that open mind, but yet that critical, mind as well as we learn and evolve.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Kerry, for coming and spending some time and sharing your thoughts and being open, with your experiences and as well. I really appreciate it and certainly are happy with the relationship the Commission has had with yourself and the people that you work with and continue. I'll look forward to having more engagements together and following the work that you do as well, and wish you all the best.
Thank you so much. It's been a wonderful conversation, so thank you so much. Yeah.
Miigwech. Miigwech.